Can you believe right now, as you sit reading this, that the most successful, most terrifying, and arguably the most crucial empire in human history is nothing but a smear of sun-baked brick and dust? We are talking about a civilization that didn't just build cities, they built the very concept of organized society, laying down laws so brutal and effective, they still echo in our courtrooms today. This is the story of Babylon, but forget the sanitized textbook version. This is the true, screaming narrative of ambition, blood sacrifice, and the absolute unthinkable power wielded by kings whose names were designed to make nations tremble. We start not at the beginning, but at the absolute zero point of chaos, the moment before the first great Babylonian emperor decided that the world was simply too messy, too disorganized, and needed a fist of iron wrapped in a silk glove of law. Picture a world drowning in silt and fire. For centuries, the Fertile Crescent, that promised land between the Tigris and Euphrates, was a chessboard of petty, squabbling city-states, Isin, Larsa, Eshnunna. Each one was convinced it was the center of the universe, each one prepared to commit mass atrocities just to control a slightly better stretch of irrigation ditch. There was no peace. Only a constant, grinding war, where entire populations could be enslaved or wiped out simply for choosing the wrong local deity. This was the Mesopotamian Dark Age, a time of profound technological advancement married to profound, endless warfare. The city of Babylon itself, initially, was nothing, a tiny, insignificant backwater. It was considered a joke by the great southern powers of Sumer, and a minor inconvenience by the northern warlords of Akkad, who still dreamed of Sargon's ancient glory. No one, absolutely no one, saw the catastrophe coming. The moment this small, swampy fortress would rise up and swallow the entire world whole, not once, but twice, becoming the undisputed axis of civilization for millennia. The first key player in this devastating drama was a man named Summu-Abum, the founder of the first dynasty around 1894 BCE. He was not a celebrated conqueror. He was not a mythical hero with divine parentage. He was simply a shrewd operator, a political predator who seized control of a strategic bend in the Euphrates River, an area where the great trade arteries converged. This seemingly minor geographic advantage was Babylon's secret weapon, positioning them perfectly to dominate trade routes and choke the life out of any rival trying to move goods north or south. But Summu-Abum and his immediate successors faced existential threats daily. They were surrounded by giants ready to crush them like brittle clay. The immensely powerful city of Larsa to the south, ruled by the fierce, seemingly immortal Amorite king Rim-Sin I, and the mighty kingdom of Assyria, expanding relentlessly under its formidable early rulers in the north. Babylon was perpetually one bad harvest, one failed siege, one diplomatic blunder away from total obliteration. The constant, suffocating pressure forged something monstrously resilient, something that learned to adapt or die. Imagine the terror in the palace walls every night. Every shadow was a potential assassin sent from a rival court. Every rumor a veiled declaration of war. They knew that to survive in this brutal zero-sum world, they couldn't just fight. They had to invent a new way to rule, a new doctrine of absolute control. They had to create an ideology of power so compelling that even their enemies would rather submit than resist the inevitable. The kings who followed Sumu Abum, men like Sumu La-El, spent their lives in relentless military campaigning, not for glory or treasure, but purely for survival in buffer zones. They built massive defensive walls. They dug colossal, intricate canals, transforming the landscape itself into a fortress designed to repel the endless waves of invading tribes and rival kings who viewed Babylon as easy prey. This was the agonizing, slow, and bloody gestation of an empire, fertilized by the blood and sweat of countless anonymous laborers and soldiers who died defending the marshlands. Then, the true civilization-shattering earthquake hit. After nearly a century of desperate consolidation, the stage was finally set for the man who would take this struggling river town and etch its name into the bedrock of time, Hammurabi. Before Hammurabi, Babylon was a nervous regional contender. After him, it was a god king, the undisputed master of Mesopotamia, the birthplace of the rule of written law. But his rise was built on a foundation of calculated deception, brutal betrayal, and military maneuvers so brilliant they are still studied in military academies today, even millennia later. Hammurabi inherited a kingdom that was still fundamentally weak relative to its surrounding peers, but he possessed something none of the others had: infinite patience and ruthless foresight. For the first 2 decades of his reign, 20 long years, he focused entirely on internal affairs. He played the strategic long game, strengthening his armies, reorganizing the labyrinthine bureaucracy, and perhaps most importantly, establishing a cult of personality that presented him not just as a king, but as a direct, holy agent of the gods, specifically the ascendant national god Marduk. While his rivals, Rim-Sin of Larsa, Ebal-Piel II of Eshnunna, and Zimri-Lim of Mari were busy fighting each other in exhausting, predictable cycles, Hammurabi was watching, waiting, and building relationships, seemingly benign and harmless. He signed treaties of mutual defense, promising eternal friendship and loyalty to his neighbors, all while secretly sharpening the political and military blade he intended to bury deeply in their backs. This level of strategic hypocrisy, this cold, clinical application of power, is what made Babylon truly terrifying. Can you fathom the sheer shock, the paralyzing terror, when the seemingly docile, law-focused king of Babylon suddenly turned his full, terrifying military might against his former allies? The year was approximately 1764 BCE, and the civilized world was about to witness the most spectacular, cold-blooded betrayal in ancient history. The primary target? The powerful ancient city of Larsa and its aging, formidable king, Rim-Sin I, who had reigned for 60 years and truly thought himself untouchable by fate or man. Hammurabi struck with the speed of a desert viper and the tactical precision of a surgeon, completely shattering the Larsa coalition. The siege of Larsa was a masterpiece of ancient warfare and unparalleled brutality, culminating in the city's eventual desperate surrender and the complete subjugation of southern Mesopotamia under the heel of Babylon. This single devastating victory did not just win a battle, it fundamentally redefined the balance of power, transferring the sacred divine mandate of kingship from the old Sumerian heartland directly into the hands of the Babylonian dynasty. The tiny, nervous city was now an empire, and the unthinkable horrors of its golden age had only just begun. The world had fractured. The mighty civilization of Sumer, which had once stretched its golden shadow across the entire Fertile Crescent, was now nothing more than a pile of dusty, crumbling city-states, each tearing at the throat of the other in a brutal, endless war of succession. This was the age of chaos, the brutal era of the Amorites, where every king was a battlefield butcher and trust was a suicide note. Babylon, though crowned, was barely surviving the onslaught. To the north loomed Eshnunna, a predatory powerhouse of military might, controlling the vital trade routes of the Diyala River and demanding tribute from terrified neighbors. To the south, Larsa, ruled by the cunning and ruthless king Rimsin I, dominated the ancient Sumerian heartland and possessed a terrifying, centralized military apparatus that made every other court tremble, watching Babylon like a patient vulture. Babylon itself was a precarious fortress built on quicksand. Its early kings, figures like Sumu-Abum and Sumu-La'el, spent their entire reigns desperately clinging to the walls, fighting off relentless sieges from the behemoths surrounding them. Their entire foreign policy was pure, frantic survival, a desperate high-wire act of temporary alliances, broken promises, and sheer bloody luck. It was an environment that demanded not just a king, but an absolute monster of political calculation to endure. And then he arrived. In 1792 BCE, a man ascended the throne who would redefine power, law, and conquest in the ancient world, Hammurabi. He was not merely a successor, he was the inevitable, terrifying product of this thousand-year-long struggle for supremacy. Historians often paint him as a wise lawgiver, a benevolent shepherd of his people. But that is the soothing lie whispered by the victor centuries later. Hammurabi was a viper wrapped in silk, a geopolitical chess master who waited decades for the perfect, bloody moment to strike his unsuspecting neighbors. For the first 2 decades of his reign, while the rest of the Mesopotamian world was locked in bloody, exhausting combat, Hammurabi played the role of the dutiful, small-time ally, the neutral party, the helpful friend. He reinforced the already formidable walls of Babylon, dug massive, world-changing irrigation canals, and systematically accumulated immense agricultural resources, all while signing non-aggression pacts and solemn treaties with every major enemy. He was the master of patience, meticulously constructing the economic and military infrastructure that would feed his future war machine, ensuring that when the moment came, Babylon would be the last man standing with resources untouched, ready to consume the exhausted landscape. Meanwhile, the northern world was dominated by a figure just as terrifying, perhaps even more so, Shamshi-Adad I of Assyria. This man wasn't just a king, he was a hurricane that swept across the landscape, establishing an empire that stretched from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean coast. Imagine the white-hot rage burning behind those calculating eyes, forced to bow and scrape before a rival king while secretly plotting the demise of every single court in the region. This period was Babylon's dark apprenticeship in betrayal and espionage. The true drama of this era is revealed not on the battlefield, but in the brittle, cuneiform clay tablets of the Mari archives, a diplomatic treasure trove detailing the web of spies, rumors, and double-crosses that defined the period. These letters show kings lying to each other daily, negotiating sacred peace treaties with one hand while sending shadowy assassins and military provocateurs with the other. Babylon was the central nexus of intelligence, and Hammurabi was reading every single dispatch, learning the weaknesses and ambitions of every enemy. The year 1776 BCE marked the single geopolitical event that unleashed Hammurabi's true ambition, the moment he stepped out of the shadows. Shamshi-Adad I, the Assyrian monolith who had held the north captive, finally died. The empire he had forged through sheer terror collapsed almost overnight, shattering into vulnerable, squabbling fragments that were too busy fighting each other to notice the shadow growing to the south. The time for humility was over. The time for the butcher was now. Hammurabi didn't just seize territory, he seized the narrative itself. His first calculated move was to shatter the powerful coalition of Eshnunna and Elam, who had grown too bold and threatened Babylon's eastern flank. He moved with lightning speed, striking key fortifications, utilizing brilliant maneuvering, but always maintaining plausible deniability, positioning himself as the valiant protector against menacing eastern invaders, rather than the true, cold-blooded aggressor he was. But the biggest prize, the thorn in Babylon's side for generations, was Larsa, ruled by the ancient, stubborn, and now extremely vulnerable Rim-Sin I, who had reigned for a staggering 60 years. Hammurabi knew that to truly claim the mantle and legacy of Sumer, Larsa had to fall, and its 60 years of stability had to be erased. It was the ultimate cold betrayal. Hammurabi had spent years as Rim-Sin's ally against the northern kings, securing his flank only to plunge the dagger deep into his back later. In 1763 BCE, the unstoppable Babylonian war machine turned south. The siege of Larsa was brutal, culminating in the complete destruction of the city's defenses and the capture of the aged, broken king who had ruled for longer than Hammurabi had been alive. The conquest of Larsa was not just a military victory. It was a cultural theft on a massive scale. Hammurabi immediately claimed the ancient, sacred titles of King of Sumer and Akkad, effectively ending the chaotic Amorite city-state era and establishing the terrifying, centralized First Babylonian Empire. The tiny, nervous city on the Euphrates now controlled the entire lower Mesopotamian plain, from the Persian Gulf to the Kabul River, an empire built on cunning, patience, and absolute brutality. But conquest was only half the battle. To maintain this terrifying, centralized power, to ensure that the chaos that birthed him would never shatter his own reign, Hammurabi knew he needed more than just a massive, loyal army. He needed a system of control so total, so rigid, that disobedience was unthinkable. He needed absolute, divine law. The hammer had fallen on his enemies, but now Hammurabi raised the chisel to carve his legacy not in mud brick, but in the immutable, terrifying permanence of black diorite stone. He claimed no human authorship for the laws that followed. No, this was the direct, unedited decree of Shamash himself, the fierce sun god of justice, burning away the chaos of the old world. The king, merely the humble scribe, receiving the divine tablet on the mountain of power, ready to enforce its impossible weight upon the Mesopotamian plains. The stage was set for the code, a towering black stela that was not a suggestion or a guideline, but a definitive public declaration of how life, death, and everything in between would now be quantified in the Babylonian Empire. And what did Shamash demand? A brutal, elegant, terrifying symmetry, lex talionis, the law of retaliation, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but only if you were both men of equal social standing. This was not equality. This was calculated vengeance, designed to keep the rich accountable and the poor terrified. If a patrician destroyed the eye of another patrician, the punishment was simple, visceral, and absolute. They would destroy his eye. The system was designed to be instantly recognizable and deeply impactful. But if that same patrician struck a mushkenem, a dependent worker, a man of lesser standing, perhaps someone tied to the palace lands, the divine price tag dropped dramatically. It was not his eye that was forfeit, it was silver. Cold, hard, transactional currency replaced the primal horror of mutilation. The law was not blind, it was keenly, ruthlessly aware of your social security number, calculating the worth of your pain down to the last shekel, differentiating between the awilim, the free man, the mushkenem, the dependent, and the wardam, the slave. Justice extended far beyond the battlefield or the bar fight. It penetrated the very bedrock of Babylonian daily life, the vital irrigation canals. If a farmer, through criminal negligence, failed to maintain his ditch and allowed the water to flood his neighbor's crops, the penalty was not a fine. It was complete, total destitution. He would be sold into slavery to pay for the destroyed harvest. The law demanded perfection, especially from those who managed the kingdom's essential lifelines, since food security was national security. The infrastructure itself was subject to this same lethal standard, placing a burden of lethal accuracy upon the architects and builders of the burgeoning empire. If a house collapsed and killed the owner, the builder was sentenced to death. This was instantaneous professional accountability. But if it collapsed and killed the owner's son, the builder's own son was dragged out and executed. This was the terrifying efficiency of a state that demanded zero defects in its construction. Who dared to cut corners when the life of your child depended on the structural integrity of a single mud brick wall? The smallest kingdom within the Grand Babylonian Empire was the family unit, and Hammurabi's law controlled it absolutely, treating it as the foundational economic engine of the state. Marriage was a contract, a piece of recorded business, complete with legal documentation, surprisingly protecting the wife's dowry even in cases of divorce or the husband's death. This guaranteed economic stability for the woman, but demanded absolute loyalty in return. If a wife was falsely accused of adultery, she had to submit to the ordeal by water, a terrifying trial where she was bound and thrown into the churning waters of the Euphrates. If she sank, consumed by the river god, she was guilty. If the river rejected her and she floated, she was innocent, purified by the gods. The burden of proof was often delegated to the terrifying, unpredictable judgment of nature itself. This was a system of absolute control, where the king's authority reached through the temple gate and into the marital bedroom, enforcing a rigid moral standard designed to produce disciplined soldiers and obedient taxpayers. Every man knew his place, every woman knew her role. The chaos of the earlier Amorite period was systematically purged by the rigid, unflinching hand of divine mandate, enforced with unparalleled severity. To administer this staggering volume of legislation, 282 laws carved onto multiple copies and distributed across the empire, Hammurabi needed a bureaucracy that dwarfed anything the Sumerians had ever conceived. Thousands of scribes were trained, not just to record history, but to memorize precedents, track contracts, and enforce the relentless judicial schedule. Every major city had its designated court, overseen by royal appointees, stripping the local temple priests of their judicial autonomy. Hammurabi did not just rule Babylon. He became the ultimate judge, the final arbiter of every dispute, from a stolen ox to a failed marriage contract. This centralization of justice was the final, brilliant move of a military genius who understood that true power wasn't held in the barracks, but in the docket. He engineered an empire where the people feared the law more than they feared the king's personal wrath. The psychological warfare inherent in the code was perhaps its greatest weapon. By making the penalty so specific, so public, and so brutally immediate, Hammurabi created an atmosphere of pervasive, self-regulating fear. Citizens were incentivized not only to obey, but to monitor their neighbors, knowing that negligence carried a lethal price tag. The code was not just a list of rules, it was the operating manual for a perfect, terrifying totalitarian machine disguised as divine order, ensuring silent stability. This legal legacy, etched into stone, survived the man who commissioned it by centuries, proving its revolutionary success. It was the blueprint for state control, the foundation upon which all subsequent Mesopotamian empires would attempt to build their own terrifying authority. Hammurabi, the calculating conqueror, had successfully traded military might for institutional immortality, securing the stability of his golden age through the sheer, unyielding weight of the law. And the empire held its breath, knowing that the cost of peace was eternal, flawless obedience. Hammurabi, the king of justice, the architect of terror, finally drew his last rasping breath after a reign that redefined the very nature of centralized power, and the entire Fertile Crescent didn't exhale, it froze. His golden age, built on mountains of treachery and secured by the iron fist of the law, was now a perfect, gleaming monument awaiting the inevitable acid rain of time. When a single man holds back the tides of chaos for 4 decades, his absence is not merely a vacancy. It is a terrifying, destabilizing vacuum that threatens to suck the very foundations of the world back into the primordial sludge. The crown passed to Samsu-Iluna, Hammurabi's son, a man burdened by the colossal, shimmering shadow of the greatest ruler the Near East had ever known. Imagine stepping onto a stage where your predecessor was a literal god-king. The moment he took the throne, the vultures began to circle, check in with predatory patience if the new king's grip was truly as unforgiving as his father's. They found that it was not, or perhaps that no mortal man could sustain such inhuman perfection. The moment Hammurabi's spirit departed, the fragile geopolitical bonds he had forged through sheer terror and genius began to fray, starting in the south. The ancient, restless heart of Sumer, which had never truly accepted Amorite dominion. The year was 1740 BC, and the southern marshes, the very birthplace of civilization, a muddy, tangled labyrinth where central authority went to drown, boiled over in mass revolt. A figure known only as Ila-Maili, an opportunist of staggering ambition and immense local knowledge, declared himself king in the extreme south, founding what history would chillingly call the Sealand dynasty. These were not mere bandits. These were sophisticated rebels who understood the geopolitical pressure points of the great empire. Ila-Maili wasn't just a threat. He was the physical embodiment of southern resentment against the centralizing foreign rule of Babylon, and he moved with surgical precision. He seized the key, sacred cities of the Deep South, effectively cutting off Babylon's vital access to the Persian Gulf trade routes, choking the primary economic artery that fed the great city's endless appetite for luxury, imported goods, and expansion. This was not a border skirmish or a petty uprising. This was the brutal, strategic amputation of Babylon's oldest and most profitable limbs, and Samsu-iluna was instantly forced to fight a desperate war on 3 separate, agonizing fronts just to keep his inheritance from fracturing completely. Simultaneously, the northern cities, once smashed into obedience by Hammurabi's legendary campaigns, saw their chance for vengeance. Eshnunna, the once great rival Hammurabi had meticulously crushed and salted, dared to raise its head again, backed by restless tribes who saw fatal weakness in the new regime. Samsu-iluna fought with the ferocity of a cornered lion, but he was fighting ghosts, the ghosts of his father's past victims, rising to devour the present. He successfully put down several massive revolts and crushed large armies, yes, but each victory was deeply Pyrrhic, costing precious resources, irreplaceable legions, and draining the treasury he could ill afford to spend. The constant drain of manpower was unsustainable. In a desperate and chilling move, echoing the ruthless final solutions of his father against Mari, Samsu-iluna ordered the complete, systematic destruction of key cities he could no longer hold, turning fertile fields into scorched earth and salt flats, just to deny their strategic value to the enemy. This was the dark calculus of a shrinking empire, choosing destruction over surrender. But for every ancient city he scorched, 3 more whispered the name of the rebel Illum-Ma'ili, and the map of the Babylonian Empire was shrinking rapidly. It was contracting from the vast, shimmering expanse Hammurabi had carved out into a defensible but severely diminished core territory centered precariously on the twin rivers. While the south was tearing itself free and internal cohesion vanished, a far more ominous threat was brewing in the mountainous darkness to the north and east, filtering down like a slow, systemic infection. These were the Kassites, fierce, unknown barbarian warriors filtering down from the Zagros Mountains, driven by harsh necessity and a consuming hunger for the rich Babylonian plains that lay exposed and tempting below them. They weren't an invading army in the traditional sense yet. They were a creeping geopolitical sickness, slowly eroding the borders, demanding protection money, settling in small, uncontrollable enclaves, and permanently altering the ethnic balance of the borderlands. Samsu-iluna managed to repel a massive Kassite raid in his 9th year, a victory celebrated wildly in Babylon as proof of continued divine favor. But it was merely the first terrifying fever spike in a terminal illness. The real, final sickness was coming from a place far more distant and unimaginable, the distant Anatolian Plateau, a land of high mountains and unforgiving metallurgy. This was the home of the people who spoke a language utterly alien to Mesopotamia, the Hittites. The Hittites were innovators, masters of the swift, devastating chariot charge, and, more terrifyingly, were beginning to master the forging of iron, the metal of the gods, hard, sharp, and infinitely superior to the soft bronze that still defined Babylonian weaponry and defenses. Their power was centralized hundreds of miles away in their capital, Hattusa, an invisible storm cell building catastrophic strength in the far distance, unknown, unheeded, yet destined to be the final executioner of the Amorite dream. By the end of Samsu-iluna's incredibly long, difficult 38-year reign, Babylon was technically secure, yes, But it was a kingdom of shadows, a terrifying ghost of its former self, having lost permanent control of Larsa, Uruk, and Nippur, the foundational, spiritually essential cities of Sumerian culture and religious authority. The once mighty economic engine was sputtering, the gods were restless and unappeased, and the great law code of Hammurabi seemed less like a testament to eternal, flawless rule, and more like a carefully carved inscription on a rapidly tilting mausoleum. 5 more kings followed, a long line of desperate, forgotten men: Abieshu, Amidatana, Amisaduqa, and finally Samsudatana, each fighting a losing, desperate, tactical battle against the unstoppable entropy that follows monumental, unnatural achievement. Their reigns were a slow-motion catastrophe, a relentless series of tactical retreats masked as strategic defenses, a decline measured in lost cities and diminished grain harvests. The world was changing, new empires were rising, and Babylon, blinded by the glorious, unbearable legacy of Hammurabi, failed utterly to adapt its rigid military and legal structures to the new geopolitical reality. They clung fiercely to the code, attempting to govern a crumbling empire with laws designed for a golden one, ignoring the warning signs screaming from the northern frontier. It was during the reign of Samsudatana, the last unlucky king of the once mighty Amorite dynasty, that the shadow finally materialized, not from the familiar south or the jagged east, but from the completely unexpected, terrifying northwest. The year was 1595 BC, and the storm had finally arrived, led by the iron-willed King Mursili I of the Hittites. He struck like a desert fever, burning through the Euphrates Valley faster than any army had dared before, crossing hundreds of miles of hostile territory to land the killing blow against the unsuspecting heirs of the great lawgiver. When the gates fell, they didn't fall to a siege. They fell to sheer, terrifying momentum. The city, bloated with centuries of wealth and intellectual arrogance, was caught completely off guard. The ensuing horror was not merely the staggering death toll, but the sheer, calculated sacrilege. The Hittites didn't just loot the palace gold. They marched straight into the heart of the city's spiritual identity, the magnificent temple Etemenanki, the very structure that inspired the myth of the Tower of Babel, and destroyed it. This was where the gods resided, where the fate of the nation was annually confirmed through ritual. And what Mursili did next was the ultimate act of humiliation. He seized the colossal statue of Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, dragging the divine figure away as a captive trophy to the Hittite capital of Hattusa. Imagine the silent screams of the priests, watching their mighty deity being hauled through the mud, exiled from his own sanctuary. Babylon was not just defeated, its soul was ripped out and held hostage in the cold northern mountains of Anatolia, plunging the citizens into a spiritual dark age. But here is the terrifying paradox of the Hittite strike. Mursili did not stay. His goal was symbolic destruction, not long-term governance. He executed his devastating strike, took his spoils, and vanished back into the mist of the northwest, leaving behind not a conquered province, but a devastating, chaotic power vacuum. Who rushes in when the lion falls? Not the civilized rivals, but the opportunistic jackals from the periphery. Immediately, 2 factions wrestled for the corpse of the empire. The first was the ephemeral Sealand dynasty, petty kings based in the extreme, swampy south of Sumer, who briefly tasted independence. The second, and far more durable force, were the Kassites. They were not Mesopotamian. They were a mysterious, rugged people from the Zagros Mountains, the eastern borderlands. These were the fierce barbarians who had been sniffing around the edges for generations, waiting for the perfect moment of weakness in the ancient geopolitical structure. Unlike the Amorites, who had integrated rapidly, the Kassites were initially alien. Their language remains an enigma to scholars even today, seemingly unrelated to Semitic or Sumerian tongues. Yet within a generation of Mercilla's devastating departure, they had successfully seized Babylon, establishing a dynasty that was destined to rule for an astonishing 4 centuries. 400 years. That is longer than almost any other dynasty in Mesopotamian history, a testament not to dazzling military expansion, but to relentless stability, bureaucratic endurance, and masterful cultural absorption. They renamed the region Karduniash, and while they adopted Babylonian religion and language wholesale, they subtly shifted the focus of power. The Kassite kings were not city builders obsessed with monumental urban centers like Hammurabi. They were agrarian rulers who valued the precise delineation of land ownership above all else. Their great legacy is the Kuduru, the magnificent, carved boundary stones that meticulously detailed land grants, tax exemptions, and terrible curses against anyone who dared violate the property lines of the elite. These stones, etched with powerful, detailed images of gods ensuring the contract, were the legal documents of their age, standing as silent, magnificent monuments to a bureaucratic regime focused on consolidating power through widespread land control rather than dramatic, expensive conquest. It was a quieter, darker form of control. As the Kassites settled in, maintaining their grip on Karduniash, the wider world of the Late Bronze Age began to crystallize into a terrifyingly interconnected system. This was the age of the chariot, and the known world was now divided into a select, exclusive club of ruthless great powers. In the east, you still had Babylon, humbled but stable under the Kassite rule. To the north, the aggressive Mitanni kingdom, utilizing superior chariotry, controlled vital trade routes across the plains. Further west, the new kingdom of Egypt, rich beyond measure and driven by warrior pharaohs, dominated the entire Levant coast. And of course, the ever-present iron-fisted Hittites, now solidified into a centralized, terrifying empire, waited patiently in Anatolia for their next target. These 4 powers, Egypt, Hatti, Mitanni, and Karduniash, Babylon, engaged in a complex, often treacherous ballet of diplomacy, war, and strategic royal marriage, all documented in terrifying detail. This ruthless geopolitical landscape is revealed most vividly through the incredible discovery of the Amarna letters, a massive cache of cuneiform tablets discovered in Egypt, revealing the highly dramatic, often incredibly petty correspondence between the great kings of the 14th century BC. Imagine the scene. The Kassite king of Babylon writing to the pharaoh of Egypt, not about war, but about the urgent need for more gold and demanding a royal Egyptian bride, treating the high-stakes transaction less like an alliance and more like a tense business deal over commodities and prestige. Babylon was no longer the undisputed master of the universe, dictating terms. It was one player in a lethal game, constantly balancing its diplomacy to avoid being swallowed whole by the giants surrounding it, desperate to keep the peace. The Kassites, through sheer 4-century-long endurance and masterful, subtle politics, held on to the throne, desperately trying to maintain the prestige of Hammurabi's legendary city while navigating the darkest, most treacherous period of international relations the world had ever known. They were survivors, adapting Babylonian law to their mountainous sensibilities, restoring the exiled statue of Marduk to a newly reconstructed temple, and preparing the city for the next terrifying wave that was already gathering force along the northern Tigris River. The shadow of Assyria was about to lengthen dramatically, and this time the threat would not disappear after a quick raid. The roar of the Lion King Hammurabi had faded, and the world held its breath, waiting to see if his golden age was just a magnificent, fleeting illusion. It didn't take long for the first cracks to appear, like fault lines running through a brittle ceramic vase, shattering the myth of eternal stability that the great lawgiver had so meticulously crafted. His successor, Samsu-iluna, was a capable man, a warrior who inherited a continent-sized problem built on calculated betrayals and endless, vengeful enemies who had merely been waiting for Hammurabi's final breath to ignite their revolt. The greatest empires are always killed not by external foes initially, but by the weight of their own complexity and success. Hammurabi had centralized power to an unprecedented degree, but that centralization required an iron fist and endless vigilance, resources which his son soon found tragically scarce. The moment that vigilance faltered, the provinces he had so ruthlessly conquered, Larsa, Eshnunna, Mari, began to twitch, sensing weakness in the capital's grip, demanding their autonomy back through blood and fire. They weren't just twitching, they were rising, a terrifying new dynasty, born in the deep, impenetrable, watery marshes of the south, known only as the Sealand dynasty, declared absolute independence, slicing off the crucial, resource-rich southern half of Babylonia's fertile lands. This was not a minor revolt. This was the brutal, strategic amputation of the kingdom's economic lungs, the lifeblood flow of vital resources, the massive grain harvests, the indispensable trade routes that fueled Babylon's opulent temples and massive building projects. All were immediately choked off and redirected. Samsu-iluna fought like a trapped beast for over 2 brutal decades, facing simultaneous existential threats from the north, where the Assyrian shadow still lingered, and the relentless resource-sucking warfare in the south. This was a devastating, eternal two-front war that did more than merely drain the treasury. It fundamentally shattered the carefully constructed myth of Babylonian invincibility, a myth that was essential for keeping a diverse empire together. The Old Babylonian Empire, having survived these terrible internal bloodlettings, was wounded, staggering, but still clinging fiercely to existence. A battered, scarred giant leaning heavily on its mighty, legendary walls. But the truly apocalyptic threats often come not from the known enemies at your border who follow predictable patterns, but from the unknown, devastating horrors lurking far beyond the horizon, driven by pure, opportunistic avarice. Far to the northwest, Across the forbidding, mist-shrouded mountains of Anatolia, a terrifying new power had been forging itself in the crucible of ceaseless warfare. The disciplined, relentless Hittites. They were masters of sudden, overwhelming movement and, crucially, of chariot warfare. They were led by a singularly ruthless, ambitious monarch named Mursili I. Mursili had absolutely no interest in the petty squabbles over the sea land or the northern Mesopotamian plains. He saw Babylonia not as territory to be annexed, but as a colossal, undefended vault to be cracked open and emptied. He viewed the entire kingdom as a spectacular target of opportunity, weakened by internal chaos and ripe for the taking, a prize that required extreme speed and brutal efficiency. The sheer velocity and unexpected nature of the Hittite advance remains one of the most shocking, terrifying episodes in the annals of ancient history. They launched a lightning-fast campaign that seemed to materialize out of the very air itself. They bypassed fortifications that had stood defiantly for centuries, covering hundreds of miles of hostile territory in a terrifying, relentless march directly toward the defenseless, wealthy heart of the civilized world. Imagine the moment the watchmen on Babylon's legendary, towering walls first spotted the dust cloud. Not the familiar, local dust of an Assyrian skirmish or a provincial tax collector, but a swirling, endless plume signaling an army from a land they barely knew existed, a land of mountain raiders. The scale of the resulting plunder was astronomical, beyond reckoning. The majestic temples were stripped bare of their gold and silver, the royal palaces were mercilessly looted, and the great statue of Marduk, the very physical symbol of Babylon's protective deity and cultural identity, was seized. It was dragged away in humiliating captivity, a theft that ripped the spiritual heart out of the city and instantly signaled the final, definitive end of Hammurabi's glorious but doomed dynasty. But here is the truly bizarre, almost unbelievable twist of fate that changed the course of history. Mursili I, after accomplishing the greatest military feat of the age, the utter destruction and pillaging of Babylon, did not linger to claim the shattered throne. Whether internal political instability in his capital Hattusa called him immediately back, or the logistical nightmare of holding a city so far from his power base proved too daunting, he simply retreated, taking his mountainous spoils and leaving behind a smoking ruin and an absolute, terrifying power vacuum. The ensuing chaos was the perfect environment for a less glamorous but far more persistent and enduring power to finally seize control. For decades, perhaps even centuries, these people had been migrating slowly into the eastern mountains and along the edges of Babylonia, quietly assimilating, waiting patiently for this catastrophic moment. They were the Kassites, a powerful, fierce, non-Semitic people whose origins remain shrouded in the deep, impenetrable mists of the Zagros foothills. They did not arrive with the sudden, spectacular violence of the Hittite raid. They arrived like floodwaters, slowly, inexorably seeping into every crack and foundation until they owned the entire structure of the state. The Kassite seizure of power was neither swift nor instantly glorious, but it was absolute and utterly relentless. They didn't just conquer the city, They occupied the terrifying void left by the fallen Amorite dynasty, establishing a new kingdom, the Third Dynasty of Babylon, which would astonishingly rule for over 400 long, quiet, stable years. 4 centuries! This sheer longevity utterly dwarfs the brief, glorious reign of Hammurabi's ambitious dynasty. Yet history often overlooks them, precisely because their rule was characterized by stability, restoration, and tedious bureaucratic efficiency rather than dramatic, headline-grabbing conquest. The Kassites were the ultimate stabilizers after a period of extreme geopolitical trauma. They immediately restored the ravaged temples, rebuilt the shattered infrastructure, and crucially, they eventually brought back the revered, stolen statue of Marduk, instantly legitimizing their foreign rule in the eyes of the shattered, desperate populace. They mastered the subtle, essential art of quiet rule. They wholeheartedly embraced Babylonian culture, adopting the title of Shar-Kashi, king of the Kassites, alongside Shar-Babili, king of Babylon, fusing their identities into a cohesive, unstoppable whole that prioritized order above all else. They introduced the horse on a massive scale, revolutionizing military transport and agriculture, accelerating the use of the chariot beyond what the fragmented Amorites had ever achieved. This long, slow Kassite era became a necessary, profound period of convalescence for the battered Mesopotamian heartland, a time of deep healing under an ostensibly foreign but deeply integrating administration. This new Babylonia, often called Kardunyash in their own meticulous records, focused fiercely on internal affairs, desperately repairing the social fabric that had been violently torn apart by centuries of endless civil war and catastrophic external raiding. The laws were standardized again, the land boundaries, marked by unique inscribed stone monuments called kuduras, were precisely defined, and a powerful, essential sense of ordered stability finally returned to the weary, long-suffering land. But even the most stable empires cannot escape the shifting, dangerous sands of geopolitics forever. As the Kassites settled into their long, quiet dominance, the world around them was evolving rapidly, forging the Late Bronze Age into a massive, interconnected network of ruthless great powers playing a terrifying high-stakes game. The rules were changing fundamentally. Babylon was no longer the sole, glittering, unquestioned prize of Mesopotamia. It was now merely one powerful player in a high-stakes, ruthless diplomatic arena involving the mighty new kingdom of Egypt, the still formidable Hittite Empire, and the rising, vengeful Assyrians in the north, whose shadow was growing longer every year. And the price of this long-sought stability would soon be paid in submission to their new masters. The Golden Age had reached its inevitable, brutal conclusion. The great king Hammurabi, the lion of the Euphrates, was gone, pulled down into the dust of history, and the entire structure he had painstakingly built from blood and cunning immediately began to shudder. His son, Samsu-Iluna, inherited a crown forged in fire, but found the foundations crumbling beneath his sandals. The moment the old man's breath left his body, the vassals who had bowed low in terror now stood tall in defiance, whispering promises of rebellion across the vast river network. The empire was too large, the administrative burden too heavy, and the price of that hard-won peace was suddenly demanded by every disgruntled governor and defeated tribe. The Babylonian machine, once a marvel of efficiency, seized up, choked by the sheer magnitude of its own sprawling success. In the marshy, unyielding south, where the Tigris and Euphrates met the churning sea, a dynasty of ruthless opportunists, known chillingly as the Sealanders, declared their absolute independence. They were the first major crack in the colossal Babylonian armor, a splinter that would fester and grow into a debilitating wound for the next century. This was not a border skirmish. This was the geopolitical equivalent of a massive organ failure, right at the heart of the empire's logistics. Samsaluna spent 25 agonizing years fighting a desperate, slow-motion war against these southern rebels, watching as the land his father had united began to slip, piece by agonizing piece, back into the chaos from which it had been dragged. Every victory was costly, every defeat catastrophic. Yet the true, terrifying, existential crisis was brewing far away on the eastern borders, the arrival of the Kassites. Who were these people? Where did they come from? To the Babylonians, they appeared almost out of thin air, a relentless wave of horseback warriors descending from the treacherous peaks of the Zagros Mountains, driven by a desperate nomadic hunger for fertile land. Their movements were swift, their intentions opaque, and their methods utterly merciless. They were not interested in adopting Babylonian culture or negotiating treaties. They were interested in conquest, pure and simple, and their sheer numbers and unfamiliar fighting style struck paralyzing terror into the hearts of the weakened Babylonian garrisons. The stability forged by Hammurabi's code was proving fragile indeed when faced with the raw power of horse and spear. Samsu-Iluna and his successors, Abi-Eshu and Ammi-Ditana, fought a heroic but utterly doomed battle against this relentless two-front assault. The Sealanders in the south, the Kassites pressing hard from the east. It was a siege measured not in days or months, but in generations, a grinding war of attrition that systematically stripped the once mighty empire down to its very core. They lost control of strategic cities, vital trade routes dried up like desert streams, and the agricultural heartland began to starve under the constant threat of raid and ruin. The Code of Hammurabi still existed, etched in unyielding stone, but the authority to enforce its absolute justice evaporated with every lost battle, replaced by local despotism and fear. The first dynasty of Babylon, the storied house of Amorites, was gasping for air, clutching desperately onto the tiny territory around Babylon itself, when the final, world-shattering blow came from a direction no one could have possibly anticipated, the mysterious Northwest. Across the vast, unforgiving steppe, moving with the speed and silence of a desert storm, came the iron-wheeled chariots of the Hittites. These were warriors from the distant Anatolian plateau, a terrifying new power block that had mastered the art of war and organization, led by the utterly ruthless and ambitious King Mursili. Mursili had no long-term quarrel with Babylon. He was simply seeking prestige and spectacular plunder, a lightning raid designed to prove the incredible, far-reaching arm of his nascent kingdom. But the impact of his fleeting, devastating arrival would forever shatter the delicate political balance of the entire ancient Near East. In the catastrophic year of 1595 BCE, Mursili's highly disciplined army descended upon the ancient, magnificent city of Babylon, which had already been weakened by a century of internal struggle. They did not besiege it for years. They did not negotiate its surrender. They simply smashed their way through the already crumbling defenses in a brutal, decisive assault that lasted mere weeks. They looted the temples until the gold glowed red in their hands. They dismantled the great palace of Hammurabi, and they carried away the two most sacred treasures of all, the statues of the city's patron deity, the mighty Marduk, and his consort Sarpanitum. This was not just theft, it was a ritual humiliation, a profound spiritual declaration that Babylon's gods had been conquered and enslaved. With the final king, Samsu-Ditana, executed, Mursili I, having achieved his goal of spectacular plunder and establishing his legend, did the most shocking thing imaginable. He simply retreated. He dragged his stolen treasures back to Anatolia, leaving a pulverized power vacuum behind him, extinguishing the light of the Amorite dynasty like a candle snuffed out in a gale. He had destroyed the kingdom, but refused to rule the ashes. Into this devastating, empty void, crawling out of the shadows where they had waited patiently for generations, marched the Kassites. They didn't conquer the rubble, they simply inherited it. Moving in to claim the shell of the city Mursili had conveniently cleared out. The great Amorite experiment, the kingdom built by Hammurabi's genius and betrayal, was over, utterly annihilated by a single, catastrophic blow from the north. A new age, shrouded in mystery and defined by foreign rule, had begun, the 400-year reign of the Kassit dynasty. Babylon, now under the control of these enigmatic mountain people, would remain a cultural and religious center, a ghost of its former power, entering a long, quiet twilight. But the geopolitical map had been permanently altered, and the stage was set for a new kind of brutal, chaotic equilibrium between the great powers of the Bronze Age, Mitanni, Hatti, Egypt, and the patient, vengeful Assyrians in the north, whose shadow was about to become terrifyingly real. The world thought Babylon was untouchable, a city of laws and gold, its walls kissed by the Euphrates. They were wrong. The year was 1595 BC, and a whisper of unimaginable terror traveled on the wind from the northwest. Mursili I, the Hittite king, was coming. He didn't just raid, he annihilated. He was a ghost of war, traversing hundreds of miles of hostile territory in a feat of military logistics that defied belief, crossing the entire length of the Syrian steppe just to land one devastating, unexpected blow against the heart of the civilized world. When the bronze axes of the Hittites finally splintered the massive gates of Babylon, it wasn't a siege. It was an execution. Mursili was not interested in ruling the city. He was interested in crushing the symbol, seizing the treasures, including the divine images of Marduk and Sarpanito, and vanishing back into the Anatolian mountains, leaving behind nothing but ashes and a stunned, decapitated kingdom. The first dynasty of Babylon, the majestic line founded by Hammurabi himself, was extinguished in a single, terrifying flash of foreign steel. The heart of Mesopotamia stopped beating, and a massive, geopolitical black hole opened up in the center of the world. The vacuum created was absolute, terrifying. But nature abhors a void, and into this power gap stepped a people nobody truly feared, the Kassits, Kashu. These were not the city smashers of Hatti. They were the quiet occupiers, the persistent nomads who had been lurking in the shadows of the Zagros Mountains, filtering into the region for generations, serving as mercenaries, settling agricultural lands, and slowly gaining administrative positions. They were the Trojan horse of Mesopotamian history, Where the Hittites left a corpse, the Kassites brought stabilization, seizing power not through a single grand military campaign, but through patient political maneuverings that installed their own dynastic rule. They called themselves the Dynasty of the Land of the Sea, and they would ultimately rule for over 4 centuries, the longest continuous dynasty in Babylonian history, a feat of quiet endurance unmatched by their Amorite predecessors. But this new Babylon, now under the rule of the Kassite king Agum II, or perhaps his successor, the records are agonizingly murky, clouded by the dust of transition, was fundamentally different. The Kassites worshipped their own obscure pantheon, with gods like Shukamuna and Sumalia, yet they wisely adopted the high culture and the powerful state deity of Marduk, even retrieving his statue from its Hittite captivity, thereby cementing their legitimacy. They became Babylonian to the core, respecting the ancient legal codes, using the sophisticated cuneiform script, and rebuilding the shattered infrastructure, renaming the entire region Kar-Dunash, the land of the Kassites. This assimilation was a survival strategy, cloaking their foreign rule in the indispensable mantle of Mesopotamian legitimacy, ensuring stability for a period that would reshape the entire Bronze Age. For 400 years, the world revolved around the Kassite Empire, now proudly named Kar-Dunash. It was an era of intense, high-stakes diplomacy known to historians as the Amarna period, where the great kings exchanged opulent gifts, strategic marriage alliances, and thinly veiled threats on thousands of inscribed clay tablets discovered in the Egyptian sands. Imagine the royal courts, the Babylonian king, the pharaoh of Egypt, the king of Hatti, the king of Mitanni, and later the rising power of Assyria, all corresponding as equals, all calling each other brother. But this brotherhood was a viper's nest of suspicion and ambition, a delicate balance of power that could shatter with the slightest misstep or missed caravan delivery. Every shipment of gold was scrutinized. Every royal daughter sent abroad was a political hostage destined for a foreign harem. And every polite letter concealed daggers of ambition and demands for tribute disguised as gifts. The Kassite rulers like Kadashman-Enlil I and Burnaburiash II used these diplomatic channels masterfully, ensuring their survival. They demanded Egyptian gold, gold for temple building, gold for military maintenance, gold for maintaining the costly illusion of absolute equality with the mighty Nile Empire. They played the ultimate middleman game, controlling key trade routes, securing their borders, and maintaining a careful, delicate neutrality, while the true titans, Hatti and Egypt, fought devastating proxy wars over the collapsing Mitanni kingdom in Syria. The Kassite dynasty understood that survival meant stability, not reckless expansion. They prioritized administration, horse breeding, introducing the powerful war chariot to their armies, and ensuring the uninterrupted flow of grain and commerce over the flash and glory of total conquest. They were the masters of the status quo, the guardians of the Great Power Club. But the geopolitical plate tectonics of the Near East were shifting violently beneath the feet of the Kassite kings. In the north, the silent shadow that Hammurabi had once crushed was growing teeth: Assyria. For centuries they had been held down, first by the Old Babylonian Empire, then brutally subjugated by the massive Hurrian kingdom of Mitanni, forced to pay heavy tribute and acknowledge foreign supremacy. Now, as Hatti and Egypt gnawed away at the edges of Mitanni, the Assyrians, under ambitious, ruthless kings like Ashur-uballit I, saw their moment to break the chains. They declared themselves free, the rightful great power of the north, the inheritors of the Mesopotamian mandate, and they immediately cast their hungry eyes south toward the rich, stable lands of Kar-Dunyash. Ashur-uballit I, recognizing the diplomatic language of the age, dared to write directly to the pharaoh of Egypt, bypassing Babylon entirely. He treated the Kassite king, Bernaburius II, not as an equal brother, but as a mere provincial governor whose authority was irrelevant. This was a calculated declaration of war disguised as a diplomatic insult, an absolute, outrageous breach of protocol that sent shockwaves through the royal courts of the Amarna correspondence. Bernaburius II was utterly furious. He wrote his own scathing letters to Egypt, demanding that Pharaoh stop dealing with that vassal, that nobody, that little kingdom on the Tigris, refusing to acknowledge Assyria's newfound status. He knew the moment Assyria was officially accepted onto the great power stage, the centuries of Kassite stability and the power of Babylon were irrevocably doomed. The era of polite exchange and elaborate gift-giving was violently crashing down, replaced by the grim reality of military confrontation and the terrifying prospect of a new, relentless enemy on their northern frontier. The great game of the Bronze Age was winding toward its catastrophic close, and the stage was set for the ultimate showdown between Babylon and the relentless, iron-willed empire of Assyria. A conflict that would define the entire subsequent history of Mesopotamia and eventually bury the Bronze Age itself in catastrophic collapse. The clock was ticking toward the ultimate reckoning, and the Kassites, despite their longevity, were standing directly in the path of the storm. 400 years. That is how long the Kassites held the keys to Babylon. A reign so vast, so sprawling, it should have been immortal. But immortality is a lie whispered in the ear of kings. And deep within the opulent halls of Dur-Kurigalzu, the rot had begun its slow, deliberate work. The mighty empire was no longer the apex predator. It was fat, complacent, and the jackals were circling the perimeter, licking their chops at the scent of predictable decline. The great royal correspondence, those infamous Amarna letters, shows us the horrifying truth. Babylon was begging. They were sending gold not as tribute from a superior power, but as desperate gifts to keep the Egyptian pharaohs from noticing just how weak the Mesopotamian heartland had become. The Kassite dynasty, which had inherited Hammurabi's crown, was now essentially a subsidized buffer state, trading prestige for peace that would never last. But diplomacy cannot buy safety when true ambition arrives. While the Kassites were distracted by the minor irritations along their western flank, the true, mortal threat was gathering momentum in the east, a civilization that had watched Babylon's glory for millennia with simmering rage and envy. They were the people of the high plateau, masters of the mountains, the ancient, relentless nemesis, the Elamites. They weren't just raiders anymore. They were a powerful kingdom that had been nursing a grudge for centuries, watching the Fertile Crescent with envious, predatory eyes. Their rise was meteoric, fueled by a terrifying king named Shutruk-Nahunte I, a man whose ambition knew no bounds and whose cruelty was legendary. He saw the Kassite weakness not as an opportunity for plunder, but as an invitation to total annihilation. In 1155 BCE, the earth shuddered beneath the feet of the Mesopotamian people as Shushrak-Nahante swept across the plains, his armies moving with a speed and ferocity Babylon had not faced since the Hittite lightning strike that ended the First Golden Age. The capital fell, swiftly and brutally. The destruction was absolute, a cultural atrocity that ripped the heart out of the Kassite legacy and erased 400 years of carefully curated history. Shushrak-Nahante didn't just conquer, he plundered the most sacred symbols of Babylonian identity. He marched back to Susa with the treasures of Akkad and the stela of Hammurabi itself, that priceless law code that defined civilization, claiming it as a spoil of war, a symbol of ultimate humiliation. He didn't stop there. He kidnapped the statues of the great Babylonian deities, Marduk and Ishtar, effectively rendering the capital powerless and spiritually void. It was the darkest chapter, a complete and total subjugation, where the citizens of Babylon were forced to live under a foreign boot, their gods held hostage by the Elamite warlords, their ancient heritage displayed as a trophy in an enemy land. For decades, Babylon was merely a vassal, a shadow of its former glory, ruled by a puppet dynasty installed by Shushrak-Nahante's descendants. This was the moment when the flame of Mesopotamian civilization flickered dangerously low, a dark age defined by foreign oppression and cultural suppression. Yet from the rubble of despair, the ancient Babylonian spirit of defiance refused to die, bubbling up from the southern marshlands. Just when all hope seemed eternally lost, a new star rose from the old city of Isin, mirroring the great revival of the first dynasty of Babylon. This was the second dynasty of Isin, and its champion was a man destined to restore the empire's honor, a name that would echo down history, Nebuchadnezzar I. He was not just a king. He was the avenging angel of Mesopotamia, consumed by the singular, burning desire to eradicate the Elamite stain and bring back the stolen history. He dedicated his reign to preparing for the ultimate showdown, consolidating fragmented territories and rebuilding a battle-hardened army ready for the scorching desert march. But the gods of Babylon were finally smiling upon their champion. The armies clashed, and in a cataclysmic reversal of fortune, Nebuchadnezzar's eye shattered the Elamite resistance and drove the usurpers back into the mountains. The nightmare of foreign domination was violently ended, culminating in the complete overthrow of the Elamite dynasty that had tormented them for generations. And the most glorious prize? Nebuchadnezzar, I marched home not only with victory banners, but with the sacred statues of the gods, Marduk and Ishtar, which had been held captive in Susa, and crucially, the stolen monuments of Babylonian law and history, including the famed stela. He brought them back to the newly consecrated city, symbolizing the ultimate triumph of native rule and the violent rebirth of the Babylonian identity, cementing his place as one of the great liberators. The victory was monumental, but the world was still tearing itself apart around them. The lingering effects of the Bronze Age collapse, that global cataclysm that saw the collapse of Mycenae, the Hittites, and Egypt's decline, were still sending shockwaves across the Near East. Though Nebuchadnezzar had defeated the Elamites, he couldn't stop the tides of new, aggressive migration flooding in from the west and north. Wave after relentless wave of semi-nomadic peoples, primarily the aggressive Aramaeans and the Sutean tribes, began infiltrating and then dominating the Babylonian countryside. They weren't unified armies, They were decentralized, persistent thorns that choked the infrastructure and threatened the very stability of the fertile farmlands. This internal erosion was slow, but devastating. The kings of the Isin Second Dynasty found themselves constantly fighting to protect their borders from these relentless, insidious incursions, pouring resources into securing the canals and the vital trade routes. Babylon had survived the hammer blow of Elam, but could it survive the millions of pinpricks from the desert nomads? The stage was set for a new, grinding struggle, a transition into the brutal Iron Age where every inch of land had to be paid for in blood, twisting and turning toward the dramatic rise of the Chaldean Empire and the final, magnificent Golden Age. The world had entered the Iron Age, a grinding, brutal epoch where bronze was merely a memory, and every man's sword was sharpened not just by fire, but by unending territorial paranoia. For centuries, the Babylonian spirit had been choked by the colossal, cruel shadow of the Assyrian Empire, a beast that had conquered the known world, ruling through fear, deportation, and industrial-scale brutality. But even monsters can bleed, and by the late 7th century BCE, the Assyrian colossus was finally stumbling, crippled by overextension, internal rebellions, and the sudden, sharp, devastating realization that everyone they had ever brutalized was waiting for their chance to pounce. The massive shadow of Ashurbanipal, the great collector of clay tablets and the ruthless executioner of Elam, had faded, replaced by weak successors engaged in endless, draining succession wars. Assyria was bleeding out, hemorrhaging resources and respect, and the timing was exquisite. The stage was finally set for the Chaldeans, those tenacious, resilient marsh-dwellers, to reclaim the inheritance of Hammurabi, not through polite petition, but through overwhelming, calculated violence. Enter Nabopolassar, a figure whose origins remain shrouded in strategic mystery, adding to his formidable legend. He was a Chaldean general, possibly a governor of the sea land, possessing the patience of the ancient rivers and the tactical genius necessary to outmaneuver the greatest military machine history had yet produced. In 626 BCE, as Assyria was convulsing in civil war, Nabopolassar struck. This wasn't a minor revolt. This was a declaration of independence that shook the foundations of Mesopotamian power, an announcement that the ancient capital of civilization was ready to reclaim its crown. He seized Babylon, a city starved for freedom and glory, and declared himself king. Yet the Assyrian war machine, even on its knees, was still terrifying, capable of launching punishing counterattacks. Nabopolassar understood the brutal arithmetic of this conflict. He could not win alone. He needed a partner equally consumed by vengeance, equally powerful, and equally hungry for the spoils of war. He looked north, past the mountains, toward the rising, formidable power of the Medes. Led by the brilliant and ruthless Cyaxares, the Medes were masters of cavalry warfare, eager to settle centuries of scores against the Assyrians who had raided their lands mercilessly. This alliance was a pact sealed not by treaties of friendship, but by a shared, white-hot hatred, a geopolitical Molotov cocktail aimed directly at the heart of Nineveh. The campaign began with a horrifying focus. The first major target was Ashur, the spiritual, ancestral heart of the Assyrian Empire, where the great kings lay buried and the state god resided. In 614 BCE, the combined Medes and Babylonian forces descended upon the city. It was not a capture, it was an absolute obliteration. The destruction was so complete, so intentional, that it served as a terrifying, undeniable signal to the remaining Assyrian strongholds: retreat or be utterly erased. The Medes took the lead in the initial destruction, displaying a brutal efficiency that shocked even the Babylonians. Nabopolassar arrived shortly after, finding a city reduced to smoldering ash and rubble, a monument to Assyrian cruelty finally repaid tenfold. This act cemented the alliance and paved the way for the grand finale. Then came the moment history had been waiting for, the siege of Nineveh in 612 BCE. Nineveh, the jewel of the Near East, protected by monumental walls, the site of Ashurbanipal's great libraries, the supposed impregnable city. The Medes and Babylonians surrounded it, laying siege for 3 agonizing months of continuous battle. The ancient chroniclers, perhaps dramatically, claimed that the gods themselves intervened, sending torrential rains that caused the Kosor River to flood, undermining the mighty defensive walls. With Nineveh gone, the heart of the Assyrian state ceased to beat. Babylon was free, unequivocally. The Chaldeans had not just won a war. They had inherited a geopolitical power vacuum spanning from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. But the war wasn't completely finished. The last loyal remnants of the Assyrian military, backed by a desperate, hurried intervention force from Egypt led by Pharaoh Necho II, retreated west for a final stand. They gathered their forces on the banks of the Euphrates, near the ancient, strategic city of Carchemish. This final confrontation, however, became the stage for the dramatic, terrifying debut of the true heir to the Neo-Babylonian throne, Nabopolassar's crown prince, Nebuchadnezzar. He was not merely a prince, he was a storm of military genius, honed by years of brutal campaigning. The Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE was the final, devastating, surgical conclusion to the Assyrian nightmare. Nebuchadnezzar led the Babylonian forces with an aggressive competence that utterly overwhelmed the combined Egyptian and Assyrian armies. He didn't just defeat them, he chased them down and decimated them so thoroughly that the Egyptian pharaoh's influence was violently purged from Asia entirely, driven back screaming to the relative safety of the Nile Valley. This victory secured the entire Levant for the rising Chaldean power and cemented Nebuchadnezzar's reputation as the most fearsome military mind of his generation. Ironically, Nabopolassar, the architect of this liberation, died just 3 weeks after the victory at Carchemish, leaving the greatest empire in centuries to his son. The transition of power was seamless, instantaneous, and terrifyingly efficient. The stage was set for the Golden Century, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, an era defined by astronomical precision, unimaginable wealth, the creation of wonders, and the calculated cruelty that would soon lead to the infamous destruction of Jerusalem and the beginning of the Great Jewish Exile. The stage was set, the final curtain call for an ancient world order. The last chapter of Babylonian terror was about to be written in the scorched earth of the Levant, and the pen belonged to the greatest, most terrifying builder and destroyer the empire had ever known, Nebuchadnezzar II. This colossal figure, the son of Nabopolassar who had crushed Assyria, inherited a geopolitical chessboard where every piece was ready to move, and he was ready to sweep them all off the board. His father had built the foundation in blood. Nebuchadnezzar would crown it with gold, lapis lazuli, and the agonizing screams of defeated nations. For 4 decades, his presence loomed over the entire Near East like a vengeful storm cloud. His primary obsession, fueled by the strategic necessity of protecting Mesopotamia, was crushing the resistance in the vital corridor of Syria and Palestine, resistance constantly stoked by the meddling phantom power of Egypt. Pharaoh Necho II saw the smaller states, Judah among them, as expendable pawns, encouraging them to withhold tribute and risk the ultimate wrath of the Babylonian war machine. This was not merely rebellion, it was an invitation to annihilation. King Jehoiakim of Judah, blinded by Egyptian promises and ancient hubris, dared to defy the Lion of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's response was immediate and overwhelming. In 597 BCE, the first great siege of Jerusalem began, a warning shot that echoed across history. He stripped the kingdom of its greatest assets, 10,000 of the elite, the scribes, the skilled craftsmen, the nobles, and the royal family, including the young king Jehoiachin himself, were marched east in chains. This was a deliberate brain drain, a calculated cruelty designed to leave Judah paralyzed, unable to govern itself or mount a serious revolt. Among those first exiles was the prophet Ezekiel, whose terrible visions of fire and ruin would soon be realized in horrifying detail. Nebuchadnezzar installed a puppet king, Zedekiah, demanding an oath of unwavering loyalty. But 8 years later, fueled by the corrosive whispers of Egyptian agents and the desperate hope of reclaiming lost glory, Zedekiah committed the ultimate betrayal. He tore up the treaty, ceased the tribute payments, and threw his destiny into the treacherous hands of the pharaoh. This act sealed the fate of Jerusalem and guaranteed a retribution so complete it would change the course of religious history forever. Nebuchadnezzar, infuriated by the treachery, returned with the full might of his army, initiating the devastating final siege in 588 BCE. For 30 agonizing months, the walls of Jerusalem held fast, but inside, the city was slowly collapsing into a pit of despair. When the Babylonian army finally smashed through the northern wall in the summer of 586 BCE, the ensuing catastrophe was absolute. Nebuchadnezzar ordered the systematic leveling of the city. Every significant structure was put to the torch. The royal palace, the defensive towers, the residential quarters, all reduced to smoking rubble. But the crowning act of destruction, the theological earthquake that reshaped Judaism forever, was the annihilation of the Temple of Solomon. The sacred repository of the covenant, built by David's son almost 4 centuries earlier, the symbolic center of the Israelite faith, was looted of its immense treasures, the golden vessels, the bronze pillars, everything of value, and then consumed by Babylonian flame. The remaining population, those who survived the starvation and the sword, were shackled together, men, women, and children, and forced onto the long, brutal march across the desert to Mesopotamia. The Great Babylonian Exile had begun, a traumatic event that did not destroy Judaism, but fundamentally redefined it. While the West was a charnel house, Babylon itself was reaching a zenith of architectural glory, funded by the spoils of these relentless campaigns. Nebuchadnezzar II used the immense wealth and the captive labor to transform his capital into the legendary city of myth. He constructed the massive walls, perhaps the largest fortifications the ancient world had seen, creating a truly impregnable fortress. He rebuilt and expanded the colossal ziggurat Etemenanki, the presumed inspiration for the Tower of Babel. And for his Median wife Amiatis, who missed the mountainous terrain of her homeland, he supposedly raised one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon, terraces of lush vegetation climbing hundreds of feet into the arid Mesopotamian sky, a mountain built by sheer imperial will. The city's entrance was dominated by the Ishtar Gate, a breathtaking structure of glazed blue bricks, decorated with imposing dragons, representing Marduk, and fierce bulls, representing Adad. The gate opened onto the processional way, lined with hundreds of lion reliefs. Babylon was not just a city. It was an intimidating, vibrant, terrifying statement of power, a place where extreme cruelty funded unimaginable beauty. Nebuchadnezzar ruled for a spectacular 43 years, consolidating the empire, patronizing the sciences, and ensuring that Babylonian mathematics and astronomy thrived. But the shadow of fate always follows the greatest light. Even as Babylon stood supreme, the clock was ticking, and the seeds of internal collapse, the inevitable weakness of swift succession, were already being sown in the luxurious chambers of the royal palace. The great king's death would unleash a terrifying, dizzying period of political instability that would see the mighty empire crumble faster than anyone could have imagined, leaving the city vulnerable to the rising, cold-blooded power waiting in the eastern mountains. The air still choked with the sulfur and the ash of 1,000 burning temples. When the dust finally settled and the sickening echoes of the looting faded into the chilling silence of the deserted avenues, Babylon was not merely conquered, it was eviscerated. The great city, the jewel of Mesopotamia, lay broken, its famed laws scattered like worthless parchment in the wind, its mighty walls scarred forever. The barbaric invaders, having accomplished their horrific task of stealing the very idols and the soul of the city, vanished back into the western wilderness, leaving behind the ultimate prize, a perfectly created vacuum of power and catastrophic instability. The Amorite dynasty, the terrifying line forged by Hammurabi, was officially extinguished, not with a slow decay, but with a sudden, devastating, catastrophic roar that shook the foundations of the civilized world. But even as Babylon wept, blinded by its own smoke, a different kind of darkness had already begun its inexorable creep down from the eastern slopes, from the rugged, unforgiving peaks of the Zagros Mountains. These were the Kassites, a shadowy, enigmatic people whose origins were entirely foreign, and whose language sounded like grinding stone to the sophisticated ears of the Akkadian speakers. They hadn't come for a quick raid fueled by temporary greed. They had come to stay, to dominate, and to fundamentally redefine the meaning of empire in the Fertile Crescent. They were not fiery conquerors who sought immediate confrontation, nor were they calculated tyrants like the kings who came before. They were, in a political sense, patient parasites, infiltrating the broken administrative structure piece by piece, waiting for the perfect, silent moment to seize the abandoned throne. While the broken populace desperately focused on rebuilding the physical walls and clearing the debris of the past, the Kassites were already surgically rebuilding the political architecture of the entire region in their favor. For decades, the transition was less a vicious war fought with chariots and more a slow, almost imperceptible geological shift in the balance of human power. They did not destroy Babylonian culture, They ruthlessly, completely absorbed it, adopting the complex administration, embracing the ancient gods like Marduk, and even learning the Babylonian tongue perfectly. This masterful, insidious maneuver marked the beginning of the Kassite dynasty, a reign of unprecedented and terrifying longevity, stretching across over 400 brutal, largely peaceful years. 4 continuous centuries where Babylon, now under quiet foreign command, maintained a strange, almost frozen political and cultural stability. This era, often dismissed by historians as a period of boring stagnation, was in reality a terrifying masterpiece of cultural assimilation, total control, and strategic geopolitical maneuvering. Under the Kassites, Babylon, which they renamed Karduniash, transformed drastically from an aggressive, expansionist empire into a respected, if somewhat lethargic, major global player. The entire ancient Near East was now irrevocably divided into a chilling, great powers club, and Karduniash held a permanent, if often challenged, seat at the deadly table. To the north, the powerful and terrifying kingdom of Mitanni, masters of the newly developed swift chariot warfare, constantly strained against Babylonian borders, while the ever-expanding menace of the mighty Hittite Empire loomed like an executioner's axe over Anatolia. And to the south, the colossal newborn superpower of the age, New Kingdom Egypt, rich beyond any imagination and aggressively pushing its diplomatic and military influence deep into the Levant. The Kassite kings were therefore forced into a grueling, high-stakes game of diplomatic espionage, trading massive amounts of gold, highly valued royal daughters, and dangerous military secrets across the scorching desert sands. The undeniable proof of this treacherous era is still buried deep in the sands of Egypt, the infamous Amarna letters. These hundreds of sun-baked clay tablets reveal the raw, unfiltered, and deeply cynical conversations between the Kassite monarchs, like the astute Bernaburiash II and the powerful Egyptian pharaohs. They were not exchanging mere pleasantries or poetic wishes for good health. They were haggling viciously over the exact price of royal brides, complaining bitterly and publicly about intercepted diplomatic caravans, and threatening to break alliances over perceived slights. "Why did you send me only 30 mines of gold when my grandfather received 1,000? One Kassite king famously demanded, revealing the utterly mercenary heart of this new, globalized world order. The Kassite ruler saw the pharaoh not as a divine entity or a brother, but simply as a staggeringly rich, slightly unreliable trading partner who required constant public pressure to maintain the flow of wealth and tribute. While the previous volatile dynasties defined their rule through bloody conquest, the Kassites defined their 4 centuries through meticulous construction and absolute internal control. They painstakingly rebuilt the great shattered temples of Babylon, restoring the vital religious dignity that had been violently stolen by the Hittite raiders. Crucially, they focused almost entirely on agricultural prosperity and internal stability, which led to a quiet, often overlooked golden age for the farmers and merchants. They established the legendary kudarus, the terrifyingly detailed boundary stones carved with the protective faces of the Babylonian gods, acting as permanent, divine, and absolutely unchallengeable records of land grants and legal immunity. These were not just markers hammered into the dirt, they were frozen curses, ensuring that anyone who dared violate the terms of the land grant would face the immediate and terrifying wrath of every single deity in the sprawling Babylonian pantheon. But 4 centuries of static, unchallenged power inevitably breeds devastating envy and ambition among the neighbors. While the Kassites perfected the subtle art of the long game, new, exponentially hungrier eyes watched their slow-moving kingdom from every periphery. The Elamites, always the lurking, ancient nemesis to the east, were growing impossibly restless, their military strength slowly accruing like a deadly, inevitable avalanche waiting for the perfect thermal trigger. And in the distant, cold north, the seeds of a truly terrible, relentless power were being watered with ambition and blood. Assyria, which had been for centuries a quiet, compliant vassal state, was suddenly beginning to stretch its brutal, hardened, armored limbs. The long, strange sleep of the Kassite era was about to be violently and catastrophically interrupted by the deafening march of iron boots, signaling the terrifying return of pure, unadulterated Mesopotamian warfare. This stability, bought through centuries of careful, cold-blooded diplomacy, was now the very thing that made Babylon a perfectly ripe, slow-moving, and defenseless target.